Georgia is the best team in college football. So naturally, that means today I'm going to tell you why Georgia is not going to go undefeated this year.
You are Locked On Bulldogs, your daily podcast on the Georgia Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Locked On Bulldogs podcast. I, of course, am Daniel, and Clint is not there. So you're stuck with me today, but that's all right. We're going to get through it together. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel.com, number one sportsbook of the Locked On Bulldogs podcast. More on them in a moment. So glad that you are here with us on this Wednesday evening. Maybe you're listening to us on a Thursday morning. Clint and I will be back together. We'll have a Friday episode for you. We got plenty of stuff that we're going to be covering. But today, excited to talk about some stuff that's probably going to upset you. Listen, there's only two kinds of episodes. By the way, thanks for being here. If you're an everydayer, like I'm talking about every day, you listen to the podcast, you know who you are, and we appreciate you. I'm happy that you're here, but you might not be happy that you're here after we get into the content of the episode today. There's only two kinds of episodes on the podcast. Two types of shows that we do. Type number one is the type of show where we are accused of being just completely ridiculous, off the rails homers, not objective at all, no data, no facts, not willing to even consider the possibility that Georgia might not be superior in every facet of every single aspect in compared to any team in college football. The other type of episode is the episode where we are accused of being pessimists and naysayers, not real fans, where Georgia fans get all up in their feelings because how dare we say something bad about this Georgia football team? How dare we criticize the decisions that are being made on the football team? And the fun part is that sometimes it's the same episode where we get called those two things, but that's fine. It's not a big deal. Today is one of the latter types of episodes because I'm going to talk about why Georgia's not going to go undefeated. Now, full disclosure, we may do an episode later where I give you some reasons why Georgia is going to go undefeated this year. But for right now, it's the middle of July. We got about a month and a half until college football starts. And I'm going to give you three reasons why Georgia's not going to go undefeated. And listen, it's not rocket science. It's not rocket science. The reasons start with the fact that it's very hard to go undefeated in college football. It's particularly very hard to go undefeated in college football when you play college football in the SEC. And so, has it happened? Yes, it's happened. Does it happen more often, actually, than you would imagine? I would say lately, it does a little bit. Lately, with the runs that Georgia, obviously in 2022, and Alabama in years like 2020, Mickey Mouse season there. Michigan goes undefeated last year. I mean, what can you say about that? Mickey Mouse schedule, Mickey Mouse season, the whole 9 yards for the Wolverines. But it has happened. Obviously, LSU in 2019. A real undefeated season with Joe Burrow at the helm. And so it's not like it never happens, but in the grand scheme of things, when you look at all the teams, yes, a team goes undefeated maybe every other year or so in college football. That's still a really hard thing to do in the grand scheme of things. Georgia, for example, in 2021 had what I believe to be the best football team that Georgia's ever had. I think the 2021 Georgia football team, now we could argue about that if you want. I think the 2021 team was better than the 2022 team. I think the 2021 team was the best team that Georgia has ever fielded in its program's history. It was not one of Georgia's undefeated seasons, that 2021 team. As you well remember, they lost in the SEC championship game to Alabama before avenging that in the college football playoff. And so going undefeated is a difficult thing to do. So even if you are the number one team in college football, even if you have the most talented roster in college football, even if you have the greatest active coach in college football, and all of those things are overwhelmingly true for the University of Georgia, an undefeated season is by no means a foregone conclusion. It's very hard to go undefeated in college football. So when we come back, I'm going to give you specific reasons for this year's team that I think it's going to be hard for this group to go undefeated. One of them has to do with the schedule and the makeup of the schedule, actually, and the other has to do with the roster construction and some matchup situations. And so we're going to get to both of those right after we come back. But first, these. And these are, of course, FanDuel. As I mentioned earlier, FanDuel.com gives you the odds for every sporting event that you could ever need. Listen, I love sports. You love sports. And I never want them to stop. But the NBA playoffs are over. But the MLB is right here. The Open Championship is this weekend. You want to get on there on FanDuel and take some lines for the Open Championship. You want to hit up a couple of Georgia Bulldogs. You want to look at Brian Harmon. You want to look at Harris English for the Open Championship. I don't hate either of those decisions on your part. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. That's right, daily. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the preferred sports betting site of the Locked On Bulldogs podcast. All right, let's get into, I mentioned I've got two reasons why this year's going undefeated in this particular season is going to be difficult. One of them has to do with the way that the schedule lays out, and the other has to do with specifics in terms of matchups and some things that I'm a little bit concerned with on this year's roster. So the schedule for Georgia is difficult this year. Is that I'm not breaking any news for anyone there when I say that, but it's not just that it's a difficult schedule. Let's talk about in what ways it's difficult. Next year, when this schedule flips, I think it'll be a different type of conversation. But not only does Georgia have an incredibly difficult schedule with games against Clemson, Kentucky, Alabama, Auburn, Texas, Florida, Ole Miss, Tennessee. Those are all, with the exception of Florida, really good football teams. And that's a brutal slate for Georgia to draw. But it's not just that they get those games. It's Clemson on a neutral site. It's Alabama on the road, as you all know. It's Texas on the road. And it's Ole Miss on the road. I think that's the three best teams on Georgia's schedule. They play on the road. And then I think you could argue that Clemson's the fourth best team on Georgia's schedule. I think you could argue Clemson's better than Tennessee. I know you could argue Clemson's better than Auburn or Kentucky. And so you're looking at the four best teams on your schedule. You are playing away from Sanford Stadium. Now, Tennessee at home is nice. That's a quality football team. Auburn at home is nice because Auburn is an absolutely terrible place. It's a terrible place to play, but I intentionally will leave that sentence short. It's just a terrible place, and so not having to go there is always going to be a win. But you're getting Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Clemson all away from home, which means you've got an August game, a September game, an October game, and then a November game that are all brutal. Each month of the season, Georgia has a brutal away from home game. That is what you call a non-stop juggernaut of a schedule that they just keep coming at you. It's not like you navigate this stretch of the season and then you get a little bit of a break. Your breaks in there are between Texas and Ole Miss, Florida. Now, Florida's not going to be a good team this year, but that's a rivalry game. That's a huge game. Obviously, if Florida's coach is still employed, if Billy Napier's still employed at the time of that game, he will be coaching for his job. Between Alabama and Texas, you've got Auburn the very next week, right after Alabama, coming in to Athens. You want to talk about a potential letdown spot. You want to talk about another rivalry game. You want to talk about a guy in Hugh Freeze that absolutely wants nothing more than to beat Kirby Smart and put that feather in his cap and begin to establish himself at Auburn and what he's going to do. This is a season-defining game for Auburn in a rivalry spot, in a letdown spot after coming off of what we hope is an emotional win in Tuscaloosa. Now you have to come home the very next week, and these 18 to 22-year-olds have to refocus. That's a scary game in between Clemson and Alabama. You've got the Kentucky game. I'm not saying Georgia's at risk of losing to Kentucky, but when was the last time Georgia blew out a Mark Stoops Kentucky team? When was the last time you went into that game feeling like everything's going to be fine, there's nothing to worry about? Kentucky just has a way of playing Georgia close. Kentucky's a good team. And oh, by the way, that's another emotionally charged game. You got Jamon Dumas-Johnson on the defensive side of the ball. You got Brock Vandegrift on the offensive side of the ball leading the way for Kentucky. Those guys come not back to Athens. It's on the road at Kentucky, at Kroger Field. So you've come off the Clemson game. Obviously, you get Tennessee Tech in there, throwaway. And then you got to go right back out on the road and play against a Kentucky team right before you go out on the road and play against Alabama. And then obviously coming off the Ole Miss game, it's the exact same thing. So you go to Texas. Let's say you get a win there. You come back and you go to the cocktail party. You get a win against Florida. Emotional win. You turn right around the next week. You got to go to the Grove and play against Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss, another coach that wants nothing more than to beat Kirby Smart. Let's say you get a win in that game. Oh, by the way, you come right back home the very next week and play against Josh Heupel. Stop me if you've heard this. A coach that wants nothing more than to beat Kirby Smart and establish himself as a legitimate threat in the conference moving forward. It's just a nonstop. The way the schedule is constructed, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts about this. You can drop them in the comments. You can leave it for me. You could tell me I'm crazy. You can tell me this doesn't make any sense. Whatever you want. You'll say it all anyway. It doesn't matter. The way the schedule lays out, see if this makes sense. It's as if even the non-scary games become scary games. Even the games that are not losable, like on the road at Kentucky. That's not a losable game for Georgia. Let's be honest. Georgia could out-talent circles around Kentucky. Georgia could give up its top 50 players and beat Kentucky. But even the non-losable games suddenly become a little bit losable because your eyes are looking forward. You're looking at Alabama. You're coming off a Clemson game. And then, so you got games like Kentucky, Auburn, Florida, Tennessee. The games that Georgia should just win. All of a sudden, they could slip up and lose one of those games. And oh, by the way, you pair those with games at Ole Miss, at Texas, at Alabama, neutral site against Clemson. All four of those games are actually losable for Georgia. So it's tough to make a case that Georgia's going to go 13-0 with an SEC championship win, which, oh, by the way, that SEC championship game is going to be against another really good team. It's either going to be against LSU or it's going to be a rematch against Texas or Alabama. So that's a really tough schedule to try to go 13-0 going into the college football playoff. Could Georgia do it? Sure. Will they do it? I just don't think so. I don't see it. I got another reason for you. It has to do with matchups. It has to do with roster construction. It has to do with not only who these teams are, but what these teams are that Georgia's playing. And we'll talk about it in the third segment right after this. The everydayers are here. We call them the 199, but they know who they are. They're here every day. The everydayers, they're out here every day, and we love them. They're the reason that this podcast works. They're the reason that we go to Chili's when we're on the road, and they're the reason that it's fun to record this show. Happy that you're here. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being a part of the show. If you've got stuff as we get closer to the season, you can always send us an email, lockedonbulldogs@gmail.com. You can always reach out to us that way. We do read all those, even if we can't reply to all of them. And so you can reach out with stuff you want to hear us talk about, or segment ideas, or things that you're looking forward to this upcoming season. We would love to hear from you in that format. At Dawgs Podcast on Twitter. You probably already know that. Let's talk about the last reason that I think Georgia is going to struggle to go undefeated this year, and that is the youth on the defense. Now, we're here talking about the defense. So I got my bucket. It's right down here. You can't see it. It's off camera. That's a courtesy to you. But I have my bucket. It is positioned here, so I'm prepared to talk about the defense. Now, the defense on last year's Georgia team was woefully unacceptable. If you disagree with that, then I don't have anything to say to you as a Georgia fan. Your standards are too low, and you should go cheer for Georgia Tech or some other program whose standards are very low. Because the defensive performance last year for this Kirby Smart-led Georgia Bulldogs football team was unacceptably poor. Now, the good news is that Georgia returns a lot from that defense, right? They had some significant returns on the defensive front. Guys like Warren Brinson decided to come back. Guys like guys like Nazir Stackhouse decided to come back. They had significant returns in the linebacking core. Obviously, you got Mike Kell back. You got CJ Allen back. You got Raylan Wilson back. You got Smile Mondin back. You got a lot. You got a lot back. Malachi Starks is back, and Dalen Everett is back. Now, how good is it that those guys are back? Because we like CJ Allen on this podcast. And I'll say this while Clint's not here. But CJ Allen was out there every snap last year. We like Dalen Everett on this podcast, but Dalen Everett was out there every snap last year. So was Warren Brinson. So was Nazir Stackhouse. So was Michael Williams. Guess what Georgia's defense wasn't able to do? They weren't able to consistently pressure the quarterback. They weren't able to consistently make plays in space, and they weren't able to consistently hang with elite playmakers in coverage. Now, the fact that all those guys are back is great news, right? Isn't it? The fact is that this is an unproven Georgia defense, but it's not even the Georgia defense that makes me feel like Georgia might run into a bit of a struggle once or twice on this schedule. It's who Georgia plays that really makes you concerned. Bill Connolly is a writer over at ESPN, and he puts together a lot of great stuff. One of the things ESPN does is a thing called S&P Plus, and it's basically just a conglomerate ranking system where all teams are ranked, and they're ranked overall, and then they're ranked offensively, and they're ranked defensively on special teams, blah, blah, blah. Let me just talk to you about some of the teams that Georgia plays in terms of their offensive ranking in the S&P Plus. Their projected offensive ranking in the S&P Plus. Georgia plays Texas, who is the 4th ranked offense projected in the S&P Plus. They also play Ole Miss, who is the 6th ranked offense projected in the S&P Plus. They also play Alabama, who is the 7th ranked offense in the S&P Plus. They also play Clemson, who's the 15th ranked offense in the S&P Plus. They also play Tennessee, who's the 14th ranked offense in the S&P Plus. If you're counting at home, that is 5 of the 12 regular season games are against teams in the top 15 of projected offensive efficiency. 5 of the top 15. There is no one in the country that plays a murderer's row of offenses. So, again, hear what I'm saying. It's not just that Georgia goes up against a lot of good teams. They do. It's that Georgia goes up against a lot of really good offenses. Now, we're both, you and me, you the listener, me the podcaster, we're both really bullish on Georgia's defense this year. We think that they're going to improve. But if you had to tell me which unit you have more confidence in, the Carson Beck-led offense or the Georgia defense that returns a lot of people from a really poor defense last year, if you were honest, you would probably tell me you're more confident in the Carson Beck-led offense. I would too. It's why Georgia, by the way, has the number 2 projected offense in the S&P Plus, behind only Oregon. And so Georgia feels really good about their defense. Now, Georgia's defensive projection in the S&P Plus is 5th in the country, 5th ranked. Okay, so it's not like Bill Connolly and other experts and the computers and all the things project Georgia to have a bad defense. Now, Georgia didn't have a bad defense last year. They had a bad defense for Georgia, for our standard, for Kirby Smart. And even these projections project that it will continue to get better. But when you're going up against offenses that are ranked, what did I say? That are ranked 4th, 6th, 7th, 14th, 15th. And 3 of those are on the road, and 1 of them is at a neutral site. So only 1 of those top 15 offenses that you play, do you get them at Sanford Stadium. 3 of them you get on the road, where your defense is going to be up against it. It's tough to go undefeated in college football. I'm not saying Georgia can't do it. And again, maybe I'll come back on here in a week or so after I have time to process and we get a little closer to the season, and I'll tell you why Georgia is going to go undefeated. But for right now, I can't see it. I cannot see this Georgia team going undefeated this year. Let me know in the comments what you think the final record is going to be, whether or not you think this Georgia team can go undefeated, and why. Tell me what I got wrong. That's fine. But just tell me what you think in addition to how I'm an idiot. That would be fantastic for everyone. You guys are the best. Clint and I will be back on Friday for another episode of the Locked On Bulldogs podcast, and we look forward to seeing you guys then.